Welcome to another History Talk with Miss Smart. I am Miss Smart. This is Miss Smart Classroom, and at this moment we'll be discussing the Emancipation Act of 1833. And for today's lesson, we'll be looking specifically as the reasons why the Emancipation Act was passed, and also the provisions or clause, of the Emancipation Act. And emancipation means to be set free, and as Emancipation Act said, it was a law that was passed by a government in Parliament, setting the enslaved Africans free after many years of enslavement. And based on my last video, you would have learned about the Amelioration Act. And if you're a student of history, you'd have already know about the work of the abolitionists to have already by this time in history eradicate the slave trade and try to improve the lives of the slaves by putting the Amelioration Act in place. The Amelioration Act failed, and so the abolitionists went straight into the Emancipation Act and to getting it fully in effect and gradually get rid of slavery. Now, what were the reasons given for them to finally pass the law? Because they have been fighting for slavery to end for many years. They've been trying to carry the issue to Parliament for many years. Humanitarians have been lobbying as to how inhumane this is for years. Why now? What were the factors or the reasons for passing the act? And one of the reasons that the abolitionist campaign kept the question of abolition in the eyes of the public. They did not stop. They were still publishing pamphlets and lecture series and cartoons and carrying the issue to Parliament whenever they get a chance, keeping the people aware, getting evidence to turn the public against slavery and slave owners. And that is one of the reasons why it was able to be abolished. Humanitarians and other abolitionists like Thomas Buxton worked tirelessly in Parliament to bring pressure in order to abolish this system. And so that is the first reason. The second reason is that many abolitionists were economists, and they lobby on the point that slavery was uneconomic in nature. And the other abolitionists were industrialists, and these industrialists saw slavery as backward and crippling to the economy, and they were now the ones in Parliament. These industrialists were the ones with power, and so they were able to push aside the plantation interest people, and they were now had a voice to say, guess what, we don't believe that this system works for us anymore, so let us do something differently. And they used their strength in Parliament and their strength in the industrial growth development to bring this to power. Next, the system of slavery and the slavery economy was declining. It was going down. It did not have the power that it used to have anymore. The system of slavery was crippled. They weren't making as much money as they used to make. It was toxic, it was unprofitable, and it was pretty much violent. And ending slavery itself would not make the economy get any worse than it was already becoming. And so it was considered to be a good option. The planters' failure to adopt the amelioration proposal is also one of the main reasons why the Apprenticeship Act was passed, because they failed to improve the life and life standards of the slaves, which means they failed to appease the humanitarians that they were trying to appease, and hence they were not able to extend and prolong slavery as long as they wanted to. And finally, the actions of the slaves themselves. The slaves rebelled, and the slaves fight against slavery. And slave rebellions such as the Sam Sharp Rebellion, through the slaves' voice were heard very loudly, and the demand for freedom was heard. And people in Britain were now convinced that the authorities failed to respond to the cries of the slaves, and because of testimonies of missionaries, non-conformist missionaries that were in countries like Jamaica, they were able to see the inhumane and get first-hand experience of the violence of the slave trade, and not the slave trade, slavery and the plantation system. And the planters' response and treatment of the missionaries. The planters treated the missionaries poorly. Missionaries such as John Smith and William Knibb, they were able to give their experience of how they were treated, and they were able to convince people of the immorality of the slave trade and planters' treatment. And this in turn allowed people in Britain to be able to unite and to get the church to unite to fight against the slave system. Hence, these actions all come together brought an end. It all brought an end to the system of slavery. And so now we know why Emancipation Act came in. The actions of the slaves themselves through rebellion and letting their voice be heard. The non-conformist missionaries giving their testimony as to the immorality and the inhumane harsh treatment of the plantation system. The economist and industrialist voice in Parliament, and talking about the retardedness and the backwardness of the plantation system that helped. The planters' inability to adapt to the amelioration proposal that also contributed to it. The abolitionists such as Thomas Buxton actively working tirelessly to bring this up in Parliament and ensuring that persons were aware. All these things are the reasons for the 1833 Emancipation Act that was passed. Now, what was the Emancipation Act? What were the provisions of this act? This act has around 10 provisions that I'll be stating today as quickly as I possibly can. And the first thing you must know is that the Emancipation Act stated that slavery was to be abolished in 1834. So that is what it stated. But with it came certain clauses and provisions that must have been followed. And the first one was that all children under the age of 6 were to be freed immediately. Immediate freedom for those under the age of 6. However, all individuals over the age of 6 would have served the apprenticeship period of 4 to 6 years. And so the apprenticeship period was introduced and as one of the provision of the Emancipation Act. And for the domestic slaves, they were going to serve 4 years, and for the field slaves, they were going to serve 6 years to just help with the transition from slave labor to wage labor, and to give the plantation owners a chance to get used to this new system, and to also give the newly ex-slaves to be able to adjust themselves and learn to be in charge of themselves and take care of themselves. Next, it says apprentices were to work for their masters, and they were for 40 hours a week. And after the 40 hours, they were supposed to be given their wages, and they were supposed to continue working on the plantation. So here you can see that the provision was still protecting the planters. They didn't just lose their workers. They had their workers as apprentices, and they had a set amount of free hours that these apprentices had to work. And finally, there was a $20 million compensation given to the planters for losing their laborers. Even though these laborers were still going to be working for them for another 4 to 6 years, they were going to get $20 million compensation. And all these things was provision of the Emancipation Act. And finally, the apprentices were to remain on the estate for the period of their apprenticeship period. They couldn't just move off. So they were still there living on the plantation, providing free labor even though they were free. These were the acts. Now, some of the acts did benefit the apprentice, and those are what we will be going into. It states that the first one that benefited the apprentice is that children under 6 as of August 1834 were free immediately. That's one thing that benefited the apprentice or the ex-slaves. The other ones that planters were to still continue to provide food, shelter, and clothing and medical care and ground provisions for them to cultivate. So yes, you are free, and yes, you are working for these people without pay, but we're not going to leave you to fend for yourself. They are still going to have to take care of you, even though after the first 40 hours of labor you should get pay. The third thing is that work done in excess of 40 hours should be paid. Next, it says apprentice could not be sold from an estate or sold as a belonging to an estate. So you couldn't sell your apprentice, so they couldn't just take you up and send it to another country or send it to another estate. So these were the provisions that protected the apprentice and the plantation owners. Another thing is that they had somebody called a secondary magistrate who was provided to supervise the apprenticeship program and to ensure that the ex-slaves were not being taken disadvantage of. Also, apprentices could purchase their own freedom with the consent or even without the consent of their masters once they were able to find the money to do that. And finally, apprenticeship period could be shortened, but it could have been shortened if the owner saw it fit to do so. And so these are the clauses or the provision of the Emancipation Act. So you cannot separate apprenticeship from emancipation. One of the provision of emancipation is apprenticeship, and the other provision is that children are immediately free. The other one is that in 4 to 6 years all slaves will be eventually freed, and that the planters were paid a compensation of $20 million, and that the apprentice had to stay on the estate. Those were the provisions, and the additions I gave you were the clause of the apprenticeship program and their benefits to the ex-slaves. So now that we know the cause of emancipation, the factors that led to emancipation, and we also know the terms or the provision or the clauses of the Emancipation Act, let us be able to now have a discussion as to where did this lead to? Was apprenticeship successful? Was this real freedom? Those are my questions to you. In our next video, we'll go into the Apprenticeship Act in detail as relates to the aim of the apprenticeship, the difficulties of apprenticeship, why it was successful, why it wasn't successful. So stay tuned for our next discussion.